Okay, in these examples here, we're just going to try to determine what is the sign, SIGN, of each of these half angle values. We're not actually going to calculate them, but we're just going to discuss is it positive or negative. So our first example, we have cotan is essentially negative. That's all I care about. Costan is negative and cosine is positive. That would be in the fourth quadrant. So I'm just going to draw a little sketch here. A fourth quadrant angle would be one over here, which is in between 2 pi and 3 pi over 2. So I'm going to write it as 3 pi over 2 and 2 pi. So notice I'm talking about theta in this case, but I want to calculate half angle. So how do I calculate half angle values? I divide all three of these by 2, or probably easier is I multiply them all by 2. Excuse me, multiply them all by a half. Turn on black. So this gives me 3 pi quarters and theta over 2 and pi. So 3 pi quarters is over here and pi is here, so we're talking about a second quadrant angle. So that means since half angle sine has a plus or minus in front of it, since we're in a since half angle is in the second quadrant, therefore half angle sine would be positive. Half angle cosecant would also be positive because this is just the reciprocal, the sign doesn't change. Since cosine is negative in the second quadrant, half angle cosine would be negative. And since secant is just the reciprocal, it would also be negative. This last two is a trick question. Since cotan has nothing to do with plus or minus, half angle cotan is sine theta all over 1 plus cosine theta. There's no plus or minus here, so the sine will be taken care of by whatever the sine of theta and the sine of cosine is. So I don't know what the sine is going to be. I'll just let this calculation here figure it out for us. So again, the reason I'm doing this is because since half angle sine and cosine both have the plus or minus in front of them, we have to choose. So the first thing you need to do is figure out what quadrant you're in, and then write the quadrangle angles, which are the ones that are along the axes. Since we're in the fourth quadrant between 3 pi over 2 and 2 pi, divide them all by 2 to get a half angle expression or inequality. Figure out what quadrant it is, and then do the sign. So therefore this one here is pi to 3 pi over 2 is clearly in the third quadrant. I'm going to divide all of these by 2, or multiply all of them by a half. So that gives me, I don't want red. Still don't want red. Pi over 2, theta over 2, 3 pi quarters. So that would be in the second quadrant again, because pi over 2 is up here and 3 pi over 4 is over here. So therefore we're in the second quadrant. So therefore half angle sine would be positive. Half angle cosecant, would also be positive since they're reciprocals. Since I'm in the second quadrant, half angle cosine would be negative and half angle secant would also be negative. So this is not an angle in standard position. How is it not standard position? Well, it's a negative. So therefore we want to write it in standard position, so it's between an angle between 0 and 2 pi, and it's a positive angle. So let's just determine what quadrant this is in. 0 to negative pi over 2, so 0 is here and negative pi over 2 is down here. So that is a fourth quadrant angle. So fourth quadrant angles are in between 3 pi over 2 and 2 pi. So now since I'm doing half angle calculations, I need to multiply all of these by a half, all three of them by a half. So that gives me 3 pi over 4, let's make that a pi, theta over 2 less than pi. Still in the second quadrant, so that makes half angle sine positive, half angle cosecant positive, and these two would be negative. Again, negative pi to negative pi over 2 is not in standard position, it's standard form. These are standard position, These are negative angles, we want to make them positive. So negative pi is here and negative pi over 2 is down here, so we're in the third quadrant. A third quadrant angle is in between pi and 3 pi over 2 if you're in standard position. I'm going to take all three of these and multiply them by a half. So that gives me pi over 2, theta over 2, and 3 pi quarters. Again, this is a second quadrant angle, so half angle sine and cosecant are positive. Cosine and secant would be negative. So here we have negative 10 over 7 pi, and I just want to figure out what quadrant, what is the sign of half angle sine and tangent. Again, I'm not really going to be interested in these two because there's no plus or minus in front of it. We don't need to determine what this sign is prior to doing a calculation. Since it's sine theta over 1 plus cosine theta, we can just let the function take care of itself. So the question is, where is negative 10 pi over 7? So the way I usually think of it is this is pi, which is also known as 7 over 7. So that's negative 7 over pi. So if I do half of this, that's going to be negative 3.5 over 7 pi. And if I add these two, that's going to give me 3 pi over 2, which would be negative 10 over 7 pi. So notice I'm doing all these in terms of negative angles because this is a negative angle. So we don't need to rewrite it in standard position. We just need to figure out what quadrant is negative 10 pi over 7 in. Excuse me, this is 10.5. Negative 10 pi over 7 is in the second quadrant. If pi, or negative 7/7 is over here. And if pi over 2 is negative 3.5 over 7. So if I add those, I get negative 10 pi 7s, which would be 3 pi over 2. So I'm in the S quadrant. So therefore, sine is going to be positive, cosecant is going to be positive, cosine is negative, and secant is negative as well. So in these examples, if you're just given the angle, you just want to figure out what is this SIGN, the sine of the half angles of all these for this angle here. As opposed to the previous problems, we needed to figure out what quadrant we were in. We needed to divide them all by 2. So therefore, we could figure out what the quadrant is of theta over 2. Here, I'm just want to figure out what quadrant is this in. Is it positive or negative for each of the applicable values? So we have 14 pi over 8. So again, usually what I do is I find out where pi is, so that's 8 over 8 pi. And then if I do half of that, I'll get 4 over 8 pi. And if I add those two, I get 12 over 8 pi. And this would be 16 over 8 pi. So 14 pi over 8 is what we're going to be in the fourth quadrant. So that makes half angle sine is going to be negative, and cosecant will be sine. Cosine will be positive because it's the C quadrant. Secant is positive, and those guys are taken care of by themselves.